if you haven't monetized your breath, why are you even breathing? You're giving away carbon dioxide for free. Welcome to the good world.
1, 2, 3.
So I'm on to a place that is fine. Your friend, then you can find the world is close. Let's happen. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults.
Hi, friend. Welcome to the good world. My name is Seth. So something that I want to talk about that I have seen a bunch of recently, it's a pretty common thing to hear. I've been hearing it in particular in the aftermath of the election, but you see it lots of other times where someone is trying to, let's say, from their perspective, create more freedom in the world. And when other people vote against what this first person sees as their own interests, we say something like, well, I hope that person gets what they voted for now. And we have this implication of because someone did something that we disagree with, they deserve to be punished. And this is related to a theme that has come up a lot on this channel, which is because it's a thing I think about a lot. But it's this idea that everything is transactional, right? Other people's behavior should be met with punishment or approval depending on what they do. And it doesn't just get to stand on its own. And there is something that, this is not a thought that is original to me. It's definitely something I've seen somewhere, but it's something I certainly believe, which is if your vision for liberation is transactional, you don't have a vision for liberation. You have a vision for a different hierarchy with you at the top, right? Any situation where you are looking at someone who didn't get on board with what you want, and you're saying, well, they should be punished for not seeing things the way that I see the world. All we're doing is reinforcing the endless cycle of people hurting each other and punishing each other and abusing each other. And it just perpetuates all of the problems that we have. Ultimately, all of our problems come down to, maybe not all, a lot of our problems come down to hierarchical structures. And we're always arguing over what method we should be using to create a hierarchical structure. And so we have this idea in the US today under our current capitalist economic system. We have this idea, not everyone believes this, but there are a lot of people who think that the amount of money that you have is a reflection of an underlying merit, an underlying worth, an underlying value, right? And there is this thought, there's even an entire school of philosophy called objectivism that starts from the idea that the amount of money that someone has is an objective rating of what they contribute to society. And that's silly. First off, the idea that there is such a thing as a single dimension on which you can rate human beings is kind of to miss the point of human beings. Like, let's for a moment step outside of the realm of humans and let's talk about fruit trees, right? And there are lots of different kinds of fruit trees. There are pear trees, apple trees, orange trees, pomegranate trees. We have a pomegranate tree in our backyard that has not yet produced fruit, but it's only a couple years old. It'll fruit eventually. We have a fig tree that did very well this year. Anyway, all these different kinds of fruit trees, right? Can you imagine saying, okay, I'm going to create an objective ranking of fruit trees? That makes no sense. And everyone knows that makes no sense. Literally, the expression is you can't compare apples to oranges. And yet, when it comes to people, because we have a number that we can put on it, because we really, really like having numbers to put on things, because we have a number to put on it, we think sometimes that the number that corresponds to how much money someone has is an objective measure of their value. And that's not how anything works. Again, coming back to the fruit trees, like you can, if you want, you can pick a single metric, right? You can rank fruit trees on the concentration of sugar in their fruits. You can rank fruit trees on how many individual fruits they create. That might get a little tricky because the definition of what is a fruit is actually the kind of thing that's going to get complicated, right? Like grapevines are technically, I guess, a kind of tree. They're certainly a kind of fruit-bearing plant. And are you going to count an individual grape the same amount as an individual watermelon? It takes the plant different amounts of energy to make each thing. And then at the end, you get something different out of it. So you can come up with a metric, but just because you can come up with a metric does not mean that that metric is the absolute truth. And so one of the things that is always really important to me to push back on is the idea that the amount of money you have is an objective metric that measures anything. And I think part of what goes along with that, part of the way that capitalism has been brought into our culture and really sort of imposed / indoctrinated, I will honestly say, into our culture. It's the common metaphor is like, it's the water we swim in, right? Fish don't notice the water, but the water is there. We don't notice that we're living in capitalism necessarily. Some of us do. But it's there, and there are all of these myths around it that are a big part of what keeps it going and what keeps it being unfair. And the way that I think about it is we have, in a lot of ways, turned capitalism into a religion in which the god is the invisible hand, right? Like literally we are saying there is an invisible hand. It's an invisible being who takes all of the things that we do and ensures a just outcome. What is that if not a belief in a particular kind of God? Maybe you're not calling it a God, but that is 100% a belief system organized around believing in a God for whom, by the way, there's not really any evidence, right? Unless you choose to believe that people who are poor are getting what they deserve and people who are rich are getting what they deserve, which is a thing that we get told a lot. But it's still just a thing that we get told. And so unless you're going along with that belief, you can self-select evidence. You can run everything on confirmation bias and pick evidence, cherry pick evidence to support the idea that the invisible hand is a real thing, turning all of our actions into justice. Or you can recognize that it's just religion by a different name. It's a kind of theism, frankly, by a different name. Because again, there is a god of capitalism. And I would say at this point here in the US, Christianity is obviously a major and sort of dominant religion in American culture. I would say capitalism is really the national religion of America. And when you hear people talk about it all across sort of the media sphere, there is a general view that anything other than capitalism is evil, right? Communism is evil. Socialism is evil. Capitalism is the thing that needs to be protected. People also, since we're in the aftermath of the election, people talk about democracy this way too, right? Preserve democracy as though democracy is the good, capitalism is the good. And so I've mentioned before, I grew up Jewish. I had never read the Gospels until a couple years ago, sort of part of what brought me to interfaith seminary. But so for the first time in my life, I now, at the age of 42, I have a favorite Bible passage. I couldn't tell you the number or book, but there is a line that Jesus says in the Gospels. I think it's in multiple Gospels because the Gospels are mostly a lot of the same stories told by different people. Jesus says, humans were not made for the Sabbath was made for humanity. What's happening is there are people who are dying. It may be the death of Lazarus. I honestly don't remember, but Jesus performs some kind of healing miracle. I don't remember if he cures someone who's sick or brings someone back from the dead. That's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is he does this and it's on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees get really angry at him, right? Because they're the devout rule followers of the religious tradition in that place and time, which is closely related to Judaism, although things changed over 2,000 years. But the Pharisees say it is forbidden, according to the Torah, it is forbidden to work on the Sabbath, and performing miracles is a form of doing work, and therefore, Jesus, you are a bad person for curing this person on the Sabbath. You should not perform miracles on the Sabbath. It's against God's law. And Jesus looks at them and says, the Sabbath was made for humans. Humans were not made for the Sabbath. That sound means we're going to take a break, but we will come right back and continue talking about this.
Please like and subscribe.
Please like and subscribe. Please like and subscribe. And subscribe. Please like and subscribe.
So just a reminder, if you are enjoying this show, please click the like button, click the subscribe button, send it to your friends. You can go to goodworld.love, which will link you to all of my different media presences. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I'm building a thing, maybe. Anyway, so Jesus says, Sabbath was made for humans. Humans were not made for the Sabbath. And the premise there is that the life that is in front of us, the lives of our fellow human beings, are what we should be prioritizing anytime they come into conflict with a system. If you are choosing between maintaining a system as it is and doing more for the lives of people, the Pharisees are saying we need to respect the system even though it hurts people. And Jesus is saying, but the point of the system is to serve people, right? So here in America, the point of capitalism is supposed to be to serve people. And yet we often treat it as though the point of people is to serve capitalism. I remember seeing a tweet several years ago, back when tweet was a verb that existed. And it said, I still believe markets don't fail humans, humans fail markets. And I cannot think of a better example of the idea that capitalism is a religion than that one, right? It's markets are perfect, markets are godlike, and the only problem is us. We are failing the markets. And so that is why we're suffering. We're not suffering because the markets have built-in structural inequities. We're suffering because we're just not doing enough to let the market govern us. And it's fascinating because I think there is something I've encountered in my studies in a lot of different traditions is the idea of like, you can't control everything, so you need to just kind of figure out how to ride the tide, right? Taoism talks a lot about the Tao, which is sort of the way. It's a non-embodied, non-theistic sort of guiding energy for the universe. But if you can get into a state of Wu Wei, you are sort of going with the flow of the universe. Islam, literally, the word Islam translates to submission, and Muslim translates to one who submits. And the idea is you are submitting to the will of God. Muhammad, for all that people love to say that Islam is a violent religion, Muhammad tried really, really hard not to participate in violence. There was literally a battle, and he sat down in the middle of the battlefield and prayed because he didn't want to hurt anyone. And eventually, according to the Quran, God told him that he needed to get up and stand up for himself. But there is this deeply ingrained idea in Islam of we just need to go along and stop trying to control everything. And it's a difficult balance to strike, not just in terms of Islam, also in terms of capitalism, where if you can find a system that works for improving people's lives, you don't want to throw the entire thing out. But at the same time, I think the challenge comes into play when we're looking at situations of people who have a lot of power, because having a lot of power results in a lot of control. And so often it is the people who are in positions of power who are the ones who are sort of violating the idea of letting go, of submitting, of giving up control. I have this sort of analogy in my head of how capitalism works in America. Because there is this idea that it is ranking something objective. I would say it's the opposite of the good world, and it is a world in which everything is transactional. And also there's a lot of luck, but also structures play a role in dictating who gets luckier. So I call it poker world. And the idea is that in poker world, everyone, the only thing that exists in our lives is poker, the game of poker. And poker is a useful analogy because when you're playing poker, there is some skill involved, right? It's helpful to know what your chance of winning is given having different cards in your hand and given what cards are on the table. It's important to be strategic about betting. You can bluff. There is strategy involved in poker, but there is still a huge amount of luck. And I haven't watched it in a long time, but when they first started televising the World Series of Poker, I watched it a bunch. And you can see professional poker players who do really, really well on average will talk about a bad beat. There are times when they play everything right, and literally the cards just didn't come up the way they want. And so if you can imagine a giant room of people playing poker, and there are new people coming into the room all the time, like people being born or entering the workforce, whatever. And They go and they sit down at a table and they start playing poker. If you sit down at the table to play poker with, say, a lot of family money, then you are in a better position than someone who comes in without any family. Right? Something that happens in poker is if there are two players of equal skill levels, but one of them has a much bigger stack of chips, that person is probably going to win more often than not because they can force the person with the smaller stack to take more severe risks. Right? If I have $1 million worth of chips and you have $100, it basically costs nothing to me to call you all in every time. Every single hand, I say, okay, I'm putting down 100 chips and you put in 100 chips. And if you win that hand, now you have 200. I still have $999,900 worth of chips. And we can repeat this. And sooner or later, your luck is going to run out and I'm going to have the $100 you came in with and all of my original money back. So Poker World is set up to give an advantage to people who come in with greater resources. There is some skill involved, but there's also a lot of luck involved. And if you go into Poker World and you don't have money, but you can convince someone who does have a lot of money to stake you, they'll give you a bunch of chips, way more than you have, in exchange for, they'll put up $500,000 for you, and they will take back 10% of your profits, let's say. Often it's more. And that also puts you at an advantage relative to the people who don't have that access to capital. And suddenly we have this situation where the people who are going to do the best in the poker tournament are the people with the most chips. And then the people who are going to do next best are the people who can befriend and convince the people with chips. And the people who are going to do the worst off are the people who come in without any poker chips in the first place. Without any poker chips in the first place. I had to take that again because there was a chime. So this actually mirrors our capitalist society a lot, right? We have a situation where there's some skill involved that helps you get money. There's also a lot of luck involved that helps you get money. One of the best things you can do for yourself is to start off with a lot of money. If you don't start off with a lot of money, the next best thing you can do is find someone who has money and convince them to support you. And if you don't have a lot of money and you can't do that, you're kind of screwed. And that is something that we don't recognize the way that our society is like that, right? We don't recognize, we say, oh, well, there are welfare benefits, there are homeless shelters, there is SNAP food benefits, there are all kinds of safety net programs. Our safety net programs are not so great. And I will tell you, something I hear people say a lot is, well, there are shelter beds available and homeless people aren't even going to use those shelter beds. So what is even the point of trying to help them if they don't want to be helped? And I would turn that around and I would say, how bad do our shelters have to be that living in a tent at an intersection is preferable to being in a shelter? Right? Like, the reason people aren't taking it isn't because they don't want the help. It's because something about the system that moves them from the street into the shelter isn't working, isn't serving them. And so they just feel like they're better off staying where they are if they can. That reflects to me a lot more on the structures that we have built, the societal structures, than it does on the individual people experiencing it. Coming back to the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. It would be like if we blamed Lazarus for dying and then got angry at Jesus for resurrecting him on the Sabbath. If we're putting the needs of the Sabbath above the needs of people, we're doing it wrong. If we're putting the needs of the market above the needs of the people, we're doing it wrong. I'm sure that people could come and look at this and say, you're a communist or you're a socialist. I don't think they would look at this and say, I'm a capitalist. But I don't think whatever system, if we survive what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the meta crisis, which is a good term, if we survive the meta crisis, it won't be because of capitalism. It also won't be because of communism. It'll be because we've figured out something that works better for all of us. And so whatever that is, I'm a believer in the ability of humans to innovate, so long as they have sufficient resources and investment. If you are someone with a lot of money, you can take a big risk on starting a new business, because if you lose the money to start a new business, It's not going to ruin your life. If you are poor, you have very little threshold for risk, and you are constantly having to make exhausting decisions. And so people who are poor are made unable to contribute by their poverty. Like, we often think that they are poor because they don't contribute. And generally, it's the opposite. Generally speaking, people can't contribute because poverty has strained them so much. A thing you hear a lot is that people become homeless because they have a mental health issue. And I'm not going to say that never happens. That happens sometimes. But having spoken with a number of unhoused people in my community, I would say that if you live on a sidewalk and you spend your day being ignored by people, being yelled at by strangers, being rained on in the cold, or being outside in the incredible heat, your mental health is going to suffer from that. And so often, the mental health issues that we see, the drug addiction issues also, because if you're really cold, meth feels warm. So a lot of the mental health issues, a lot of the drug addiction issues, and a lot of the lack of productivity issues that we see from unhoused people are caused by the poverty. And we think that people are poor because they have failed in some way. And in fact, it is just so much harder for them to contribute and to succeed because of the poverty, because it puts such a strain on a human being's brain and emotional wellness. And the only reason I think that we believe these ideas that people deserve what they're getting is because these myths of the capitalist religion have been drilled into our heads. This idea that the invisible hand is up there doing justice for all of us. But again, humans were not made for capitalism. Capitalism was made for humans. Humans were not made for markets. Markets were made for humans. What matters is the human well-being. We are here to serve each other and to serve this incredible experience we get to have called life. We are not here to serve a hypothetical economic principle. We're going to end right there. Well, thank you, friend, for your visit today. Now it's time we both go on our way. The world will still be insane tomorrow, but don't let that fill your heart with sorrow. You can thrive in a desert, just ask a saguaro. Please give to my Patreon. Capitalism is fun. Let's build a world that is good. This is a show for adults. Bye, friends.